Good morning, everybody. I'm really glad to see that all of you at least made it safely here to Maastricht. I saw some of your faces last night, but I'm also happy to see new ones here. My name is Carlos Bravo, so I am a PhD student. I'm very close to finishing my thesis, defending in 2 weeks, in Pompeu Fabra University, and I will be starting also postdoc at the Hebrew University of Jerusalem in like 2-3 weeks. So it is actually, I'm also working here at the UIC's Graduate Forum committee as an events officer, and as such, it is my pleasure again to welcome you and also to introduce this fantastic keynote lecture that will mark the beginning of this UIC's Graduate Forum conference. This lecture is entitled EU Foreign Policy, 30 years after the signature of the Maastricht Treaty. And it will be delivered by Professor Gergana Noutcheva, who I would like to thank first for accepting our invitation to talk to you. And I will now proceed to introduce. So Professor Noutcheva, she's an associate professor in international relations and European foreign policy at the Political Science Department of Maastricht University. So she's more or less a local, so to say. She holds a PhD in international relations from the University of Pittsburgh in the USA. And she teaches international relations, European foreign policy, and EU democracy promotion. Her research focuses on the European neighborhood policy and democratization in the Balkans and the post-Soviet space. And her articles have been published pretty much in, I would say everywhere, but just to name a few journals, Journal of Common Market Studies, Journal of European Public Policy, West European Politics, Journal of European Integration, etc., etc. So those of you who are familiar with the literature, pretty much everywhere where you can publish. So she's also the author of European Foreign Policy and the Challenges of Balkan Accession, Conditionality, Legitimacy, and Compliance. So without further ado, over to you, Professor Noutcheva. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Carlos. Thank you for the invitation and welcome to Maastricht. Welcome to Maastricht University. It is really a pleasure to host you. And I hope you make the most out of these deliberations and discussions you're going to have in the course of this event. Now, what I'd like to do today is really have a conversation with you about EU foreign policy, where we started, where we've got to, and where we are heading. So I very much hope that you join this discussion as we go along, because a lot of the topics that I'm going to address, we are living them in this very moment, and no one is indifferent to what's happening around us. And we are active participants as citizens in deciding in which direction Europe will head. So please do not hesitate to interrupt me at any moment to bring in your points. Now, I am going to start with, the way I see EU foreign policy and scholarship on EU foreign policy developing in the last 30 years, by presenting it as two narratives that intersect at all time. And one of the narratives, or the internal story, I call it an inside-out perspective. It's really an institutional story, right? It's a story of treaty change. It's a story of institutional innovation at the European level. It's a story of empowerment, you could say, of EU decision-making. And accompanying it has been a quest to make this a coherent system, a coherent institutional system, in the sense that, how should we align all the tools that we have available across the functional fields of foreign policy and make them work towards a single goal. Now, that's a positive story, if you will, right? If you look at the last 30 years, and I'm going to walk you through those very briefly, you could say this is a story that's going in, in the direction of more integration. It's in the direction of more unity, in the direction of more consensus. And then there's the other story, sort of the outside-in perspective, or what's happening outside of Europe while Europe is focused on its own internal organization and governance. And this one is a less happy one, right? It's a less positive one. It's a story that's basically filled with crises, mostly, the ones that we feel mostly are the crises in the neighborhood, in the immediate vicinity, whether this is in the Balkans, whether this is further in the South Caucasus or in the Middle East and North Africa, right? So this is a story of crises that the EU is forced to respond to. And in that reaction, the EU often appears weak and impotent and even irrelevant at times. Okay, and many actually of the developments on the internal front, I would argue, have been pushed by external crises. Okay, so I am going to, and in all times, these two stories, these two narratives intersect. I am going to now sort of develop a little bit this idea, right? And start with the internal story, or sort of the inside-out perspective. And of course, EU foreign policy, if we take a longer term perspective, it's longer than 30 years. It doesn't start at Maastricht, right? With the Maastricht Treaty. It starts with European political cooperation, which is a fairly low-key sort of way of engagement, non-binding, but yet we have there the kernels that are going to grow further. And progressively through treaty change, we have, the CFSP as we know it, introduced at Maastricht with the Maastricht Treaty, 93, as the second pillar at the time, which, outlived its usefulness and was abolished down the lines, but nevertheless. And then at the Amsterdam Treaty, we have the position of the High Representative for CFSP established. This is a major milestone. Sort of, we have a core diplomat, we have someone to call to. If you are somewhere, a foreign minister out wanting to talk to Europe. Then in 2003, with the Nice Treaty, we have the structures of the common security and defense policy established. So now Europe can deploy missions, civilian and military, and actually act as crisis manager. And with the Lisbon Treaty, we also have the External Action Service. This is the diplomatic core. We have a kind of foreign ministry, right, that supports the first diplomat, the foreign minister, they thought. And these are just a few milestones, right? A few milestones that indicate that first story, right? That first narrative about deepening integration and about institutional innovation. Now, where is this heading, right? We are told that we are living a historic moment at the moment. This is a watershed moment, a turning point of a sort. A lot of metaphors have been used to describe how Russia's war against Ukraine has shaken the European project to the core. And so now the discussion is towards greater strategic autonomy. And here, this is an old debate, actually. This goes back to a main cleavage in EU foreign policy making between those that prefer a very substantial role for the United States in security and defense in Europe, and those who actually prefer the Europeans to take care of themselves more and more. And clearly, the lines are not incompatible, but that debate has been brought back to the table very vigorously with the latest developments. And we've seen some very, very important changes happening, you know, within the course of weeks, something that we thought was unthinkable 2-3 months ago. Suddenly we see a desire in Germany to spend more on defense, to develop capabilities and military capabilities. In particular, we have the EU deciding, you know, unprecedented decision to provide lethal assistance, lethal weapons to an ally, to Ukraine. And we have all kinds of discussions reinvigorated. The strategic compass, one of them, this is the closest that we get to having a military doctrine, right? We have the battle groups, the closest that we have to a standing army, right? We have PESCO cooperations on project basis when it comes to defense matters. So we have, you know, increased discussions about how EU and NATO should coordinate more. Now, the strategic autonomy debate goes beyond security and defense. Okay, it's a much larger discussion. We also saw during the pandemic that, you know, we are vulnerable to manufactured products produced around the globe, which we have not invested in, which we have de-invested in, or which we have lost know-how to produce at all. And so there's a rethink about EU industrial policy as well. Investment in a strategic infrastructure, in strategic production. So the discussion is larger than security and defense, but you know, the direction is we are getting more united, and there's consensus to address very sensitive topics until recently, and to cross lines that were unthinkable to cross a couple of months ago. Let me tell you the parallel narrative, right? If you are looking at the EU from the outside in, what was happening at these very times while the EU was developing its institutional infrastructure, its governance infrastructure for foreign and security policy making. Now, it starts in the early 90s with the Balkan Wars of Secession. And this was a time when Europe was completely absent, right? It was announced as the hour of Europe, yet, you know, Europe couldn't do anything to prevent the bloodshed and stop the bloodshed once it's erupted. So at the time, we didn't have CSDP, we didn't have a high representative who could intervene diplomatically, right? So it was very much at the background of the developments in the Balkans, right, that the member states decided to proceed along the lines of more integration in that area. Now, not everything is so negative about the 90s. In the 90s, we also have the EU developing its enlargement policy for Eastern Europe. And you have probably heard it zillion times that enlargement to Central and Eastern Europe has been the most successful EU foreign policy so far. Okay, why? Because over the course of a decade, you could argue, not more, a decade and a half, the EU oversaw the democratization of these countries, their economic transformation, and they acceded to the EU in the early 2000s, right? Obviously, there are question marks about whether these democratization processes were sustainable, were deep enough, were really consciously made, right, choices. But by and large, this is viewed as a very successful policy. Okay, now Europe doesn't stop with the current members, and there are regions bordering the current EU that have also been in turmoil throughout that time. And I've singled out here a few of those sort of crises in the neighborhood that have been fundamental about how foreign policy has evolved. And I'll start with you know, the societal mobilizations for democracy, you could argue, in Eastern Europe, the so-called color revolutions, but also sort of the Arab Spring moment, right? It was a short-lived moment, but it was a moment of hope that the societies in the Middle East and North Africa could embark on political pluralism, on a more democratization trajectory. And we've also sort of seen the turmoil more generally when it comes to the war in Syria and when it comes to the war in Libya. And of course, in the East, we have the sort of Russian interventions in Georgia, in culminating now with the full-scale invasion in Ukraine. So these developments have been at the core of how the neighborhood policy has evolved and how the EU's Russia policy has evolved. Right? Again, very much pushed by what's happening outside and very much sort of the EU catching the EU unawares, right? Sort of the EU is always running a little bit behind the curve here and is always shocked and surprised to discover yet another fire it has to put out, okay? Regardless of its internal sort of developments. And I have added here also another shock moment, right? The election of Donald Trump to the White House, 2016, which really sent shockwaves across Europe. And all of a sudden there was the question of, can we rely on Article 5 in the NATO founding act for our own security? Okay, so this was already invigorating the strategic autonomy debate, right? And where is it all heading? Now, we are told that, you know, we are heading towards a new security order in Europe, right? Because Russia's aggression in Ukraine has done just that. It has challenged to the core our own rule-based order that we thought we've socialized everyone into accepting and into believing in, and yet not. And so the talk as of late is that the EU is pushed to be more geopolitical as a result of these external developments. Right? Okay, maybe it's a geopolitical actor by accident, maybe it's not by choice, and maybe the EU geopolitics, if it exists, it has liberal grains in it, but nevertheless, right, the mainstream discussion today is that, you know, geopolitics is coming back, and probably we have sort of the beginning of that already in 2016 with the adoption of the EU global strategy, where, you know, the principle of pragmatic, the notion of principled pragmatism, right, was put forward as the main doctrine, so to say, which is to say the EU has to take care of its own interests and clearly promote and defend its values where it matters and where it can. But certainly there's a more focused discussion now about what the European interest is and how we can defend the European interest better together. Now, we are also, you know, living today is the moment when, you know, the member states have to decide whether, you know, Ukraine, Moldova, and Georgia would be given an accession prospect, a membership perspective, which is going to entirely change the name of the game for enlargement policy. And indications are that, yes, Ukraine and Georgia will be given, Ukraine and Moldova will be given candidate status, which opens up again the discussion about, well, what kind of enlargement policy? Because while it worked for Central and Eastern Europe, the way in which the EU designed it in the 90s, it is no longer working in the Western Balkans, who are also candidates for accession. So something is not right there if these countries have been stuck in limbo in the last 20 years or so, and they're not moving forward, right? They are not progressing on democratic reforms, quite the opposite, actually. They're going backwards. So the question of what to do, right, with these countries is on the table, and how to structure a relationship that goes beyond this in or out question, right? How can we devise a strategy that envisages some kind of steps of integration that fall short of full membership, right? To fill in the vacuum that these countries have filled in. Now, if Ukraine and Moldova and perhaps even Georgia are upgraded, right, and suddenly become enlargement candidates, there's a big question mark about, well, what happens to the European neighborhood policy? Do we need an European neighborhood policy? Is it an obsolete construction, a framework that has no longer is no longer useful? Clearly, the EU has neighbors that are going to stay the same, right? They are, the Middle East and North Africa will be there even after the ENP is gone. So we have to come up with renewed ideas of how to engage with neighbors, both on the east and on the south. So again, a big policy question. And well, clearly the one that's very, very pertinent at the moment is what place for Russia in the European security order, because Russia has felt excluded, right? It has also rejected the way in which we conceive of security in Europe. We conceive of, sovereign rights of nations, right? Can we find a formula in which, Russia's behavior is at least contained, right? If we don't envisage with the current regime in Kremlin, in Moscow, a very far-fetched cooperation schemes, okay? Again, a big question. And then there's the US question, which is linked to strategic autonomy. And everyone is worried what is going to happen at the next elections in the United States. Are we going to have, another moment of Trump coming back, or someone like Trump coming back? And can we really rely on NATO and the United States for, providing for our security, and can we take care of ourselves? Okay, again, a lot of open questions. So on the one side, we have seen sort of the internal integration story. That's a very, very positive one. And on the other side, I've tried to sort of walk you through some of the key questions, right? That key crises and key questions, policy questions that are still open and for which the EU doesn't have an answer or has partial answers, perhaps. Now, I'm going to spend a few minutes talking about how the scholarship on EU foreign policy has reflected on these two developments, okay? The one which is the institutional story and the other one which is a crisis story, okay? I've picked a few. I can't do justice to a very, very rich debate, but I've just picked a few that I think have really pushed the boundaries, right, and presented new and novel ideas about, emerging out of, the scholarship on the EU. And of course, we've always, in international relations, in foreign policy, we have always argued which is the right lens to study EU foreign policy. Should we use international relations theories, right, and treat the EU as a state, or should we treat the EU as an international organization? So there has always been this sort of duality, right, in approaching the EU. But when it comes to internal governance, so how can we explain the state of EU foreign policy integration, the progression here of closer integration? I think this flurry of institutional development has given rise to a lot of institutionalist approaches, right? Institutionalist of all variants, right? Historical, rational choice, sociological, that have produced very, very new insights on the example of the EU. Alongside it, I would also single out the Constructivist Scholarship, right, coming out from, this again linked to the institutional development, that the whole institutional environment in Brussels has provided ground for a lot of conceptualizations of socialization and how diplomats hanging out together in Brussels create what we know by now a coordination reflex, and how these exchanges have led to a redefinition of what member states want and what member states prefer to do, right? And in that interaction, how we've reconstructed our identities as Europeans to be able to take the decisions, that are taking care of the European interest. Okay, so I've singled out these few lines of scholarship and of very interesting arguments being put forward by some scholars, and the list is not exhaustive. There's a lot of, probably you are also contributing to these traditions, okay? But this is quite remarkable. And every single institution that we have in the foreign policy field has been studied from various angles, and we've gained a lot of new insight about it. Now, on the external governance front, or how does the EU project power beyond? What are the mechanisms here? So that has been the debate. And here we also have rational approaches and sort of more constructivist approaches. Now, the mainstream debate has been on conditionality, leverage, external incentives, how the EU has been able or not able to incentivize countries outside the EU to basically reform, take on board EU rules and regulations, comply with EU norms and values. And, related to that, although a constructivist angle to it, is the whole idea of how the EU has been able to exercise influence through what it is, through its norms, its values, through perhaps actively socializing and engaging with these countries and trying to sort of reach out to them on a non-coercive basis, on a non-hierarchical basis. And this scholarship is less developed, right? There's less accounts there, but this is nonetheless very, very interesting, right? To sort of observe these arguments being put forward by a lot of scholars, and it's on the rise, I would say. Now, and perhaps the flagship debate that we have in EU foreign policy is about what kind of power the EU is. And here we have unique contributions, sort of the EU being a civilian power and the normative power debate, right, which was spurred by young manners, but which has had a lot of other scholars contributing, also criticizing this idea. But this has occupied quite a bit of taken quite a bit of spaces in these flagship journals that you mentioned, Carlos, right? So this has been a real debate, and it's not, over, right? And I'm going to say a few words about this. Now, where are we heading as a community? Where do I see a lot of upcoming research in the field. I already mentioned sort of the geopolitical turn in EU foreign policy studies. We have quite a bit of, that's an idea that's firmly established in the policy debate. But, there's also the academics are catching up. And so we have a lot of contributions from that particular perspective, right? That the EU has, accidentally become a geopolitical actor, and sort of the main talk of today is that with, the major threat, military threat that the EU is facing, these days, there's no other way, right? The EU is forced again to go down the geopolitical road, okay? Does that mean the end of normative power? And I think that's also a big question. Does that mean the end of normative power, or can we still talk about the EU as a norm setter, the EU defining what is normal, right, beyond its boundaries, beyond its own community? And we have actually Jan Manners and Thomas Diaz, but also others, are working on a reconstitution of that idea, right? So restatement of normative power, in the sense that, the planet is facing numerous crises, whether this is economic inequality, whether this is climate change, whether this is proxy insecurity with all of the conflicts around Europe, whether this is authoritarian resilience, right, around the globe. And so the best way, they are arguing from a critical perspective, right, the best way to address the organic planetary crisis, that's how Jan Manners puts it, is through a normative approach, right, where the EU is actually listening to its partners and is trying to also understand, right, what the others want, and try to come to solutions that are win-win solutions for everyone. So the normative debate is not over, I would say. And also, if you think of the current war, in the current Russian aggression, right? We know that there's lots of realist explanations about it. We also saw that liberalism, but I'm not sure everyone is convinced about realism. If anything, from my point of view, realism has proven wrong on this one. We've also seen now, the whole interdependence with Russia didn't prevent the war, right? So there's something about, liberal thinking that we need to reconsider and rethink. But for me, the normative argument of why this is happening is very strong, right? And the whole idea that, the democratization of Ukraine and Ukraine's embrace of EU's values and of EU's norms have been at the core of the dispute, right? And Russia feeling threatened by a body of norms that it doesn't espouse, okay? So the normative argument, I think, is far from being dead, and we are going to see, I think, more contributions on this. Now, where I also see a lot of upcoming debate is on the whole issue of contestation, which has an internal dimension, but also an external one. The internal one brings into focus domestic factors in foreign policy making. And so we've heard about, populists contesting, EU foreign policy with non-governmental actors, that is, but we've also seen concrete governments, right, questioning and contesting sort of the very norms and rules on which foreign policy cooperation is based in Brussels. That is why you know, we have arguments about de-Europeanization, right? Or, you know, the whole, I mean, I don't have to go far, right, to name a few examples. We have Bulgaria using its vetoes at the moment to block North Macedonia and Albania. We have Viktor Orban blocking a few important foreign policy decisions, right? So there is contestation, right, internally. And we need to account for it. We need to understand what is going on, what are the motivations of these actors, because this can potentially be a stumbling block. But there's also a lot of reflection on how actors outside the EU contest the EU. And here, obviously, we have Russia, but we have Turkey. You know, that contestation goes beyond the EU. It's directed at the liberal international order, right? And it draws on scholarship in international relations that is on norm contestation, okay? And we need to understand, for example, why there are constituencies, there are segments of society in Europe, but elsewhere also, that buy Putin's discourse, for example, right? And this we can't just bracket, right? This is important. We need to understand it, even if we don't agree with it. Okay? And I think there's a lot of new scholarship that's coming up in that vein. And finally, I think that's one that's going to be with us for a long while. It comes under different headings. I've put here decentering, post-colonial approaches, critical perspectives, right? But it all links to sort of the realization that our studying of EU foreign policy, right? This is a very Eurocentric narrative, okay? This is a debate that we are having with ourselves, and we are kind of imposing on others. And we are not engaging sufficiently with voices outside Europe, okay? And so that's, we are losing a lot here. And this goes both to, you know, the practice of EU foreign policy, but also the study of EU foreign policy, okay? And there are scholars here that have called for more attention to that the EU has to basically consciously reflect on its own assumptions when it comes to approaching other regions, right? And it has to give space, it has to give agency to societies, elites, leaders outside the EU to basically reconstruct a policy that's fairer, okay? And I think that will be upcoming as well. And, you know, you see occasionally articles popping up in important journals that develop that line further. And I am going to finish basically with the final reflection on how, you know, the current aggression against Ukraine is again changing us, both internally and externally, to come back to my starting point, that these two intersect again, okay? And, you know, internally, it's really pushing a transformation, a profound transformation that's not only foreign policy linked. It's not only linked to, you know, how we get together institutionally to take care of our own interests. It also affects our daily lives. It also affects the energy transition, right? There's an opportunity here by, you know, in which you know, we can actually, well, disconnect from gas and oil and become greener, but this is not going to be cheap, right? This is going to be a very expensive transition. Do we really have the consensus to go all the way? And you can already hear two camps forming. One, which is, you know, we need a fast peace in Ukraine so that we can get back to business as usual, because it's costing us a lot. And then there's the other camp that's saying, well, actually justice here is more important. And so you can't force Ukraine into a settlement that, you know, it's uncomfortable with, and which is also going to be a temporary one because the problem can ignite in the future. But this is a key question, right? And a question on which we already see polarization within the European society, within the citizenry, and which, you know, it will depend a lot on how our political elites manage this cleavage, right? And how we get out of that situation, of that conflict, of that war, on that major question, right? Energy and climate change, because climate change is existential. If there is one societal challenge that's most important, that's that. And how we act now will affect generations after us, and will probably even affect the fate of the planet. So that's very serious stuff. And so Ukraine is pushing us here, sort of, well, Russia's behavior in Ukraine is pushing us here to rethink and possibly change along the way. And externally, and I already alluded to this, externally, we are also in a watershed moment, right? With, you know, the applications of Ukraine and Moldova and Georgia, we need to rethink the map of Europe, the political map of Europe again, right? And, you know, it was short-sighted and unstrategic, right, to basically sort of divide the post-Soviet space into members and non-members. This was unsustainable from the beginning, from the point of view of everyone who knew something about the region, right? You can't, from an identity point of view, you cannot, you know, construct, you know, nations into members and non-members with such a policy. So now there's a chance of getting this right, actually. But in the process, we have to rethink the political community, and you know, this whole binary position of members and non-members. And can we have relations with these countries that are in between, that, you know, create the feeling of inclusion, while at the same time providing space for them to improve and develop and reach sort of the standards that are required. And I think I'm going to stop here, because I hope I've provided a lot of food for thought, and I hope we can now have a conversation about some of these ideas, but also many others that you are interested in. Thank you.
Thank you so much. This was actually right on time. So this, besides being right on time, it's been a fantastic overview of EU foreign policy. I think both people who are working on this topic and people that work on the broader area of European studies and are less familiar with foreign policy have found it really, really useful. So now we have a couple of minutes for questions from the audience. I have myself prepared some, so don't worry. But you know, I'm hesitant as to whether I should abuse my position and start asking questions, or whether you want to go ahead first. So if you have any questions, just please raise your hand. I see that for the time being there are none, so I will start. So my first question is about, of course, the consequences of the recent turn of events in Ukraine for EU foreign policy. Basically, I'm thinking about the varying or changing position of countries that have traditionally been thought as being under the sphere of influence of Russia. I'm referring specifically to the case of Kazakhstan, but have very recently shown that maybe they are not always going to be aligned or in favor of Putin's decisions. So my question is whether, I mean, maybe if you don't know, it's completely fine, but whether there are any signs that the European Union, which is in dire need of energy resources, and being Kazakhstan a major producer of natural gas and oil, whether there are any signs that there will be an approximation to Kazakhstan taking advantage of this, so to say, changing position towards Russia, or whether it's still perceived as very much under the sphere of influence of Putin, and doing so would even be considered an aggression and make things even worse. Thank you.
Okay, so we take a few more. Would you like me to respond immediately? Okay.
Please go ahead. So before there is an actual, I'm gonna have fun now. Before asking your question, I'm gonna throw you this. Yeah, so you have to put it under your hand. This is a kind of a mic. So just introduce yourself, say who you are, and good luck.
I work for the International Commission on Missing Persons. Do I wear it or what?
Sure, I mean,
Yes, the mic is on the other side.
So I work for the International Commission on Missing Persons. We are currently, let's say, dealing with the aftermath of the Balkan Wars, as in, accounting for missing people, DNA identification or whatever, and currently dispatched in Ukraine, since it's happening right now and we need to account for war crimes and maybe send the perpetrators in The Hague like we did with Yugoslav crimes. So my question is, you mentioned earlier that Europe is not, or it wasn't meant to be a geopolitical, let's say, organization. I mean, in the beginning, I believe it was entitled to be a geopolitical organization and try to protect its borders and try to, let's say, protect the economy through rule of law and standardization. And right now we steamed away from that. And then we understood that even after the 90s, the war in the Yugoslav region, or even now in Ukraine, aren't supposed to take a more affirmative action rather than just letting stuff happen and then maybe dealing it like us right now, 20 years in the past, still try to, locating mortal remains or still trying to enact peace in the Balkans, still try to make, let's say, multinational or multi-ethnic peace conferences or peace talk. I mean, right now it's happening the same in Ukraine too. So
You have a feeling of déjà vu.
okay, do we want another question?
Maybe we take the other one.
Another hand there at the back. So let's do the catching. Oh, come on. Let's not compromise anyone's security or physical integrity.
Okay, good morning, everybody. I'm Obgola Ebwe. I'm a PhD student at the University of Urbino in Italy. And my question today, although I didn't come on time, but I'm a bit intrigued in terms of how this affects Africa. Because first of all, we've had crises in Africa and the EU's response was different when it comes to attending to those violent regions in Africa, which is still currently going on till date. And also in terms of the economic relations with Africa, is there a chance that the EU can actually expand also to getting energy, gas from Africa? Because, for example, in Nigeria, we are like one of the major producers of oil, and we also export these. Even we have gas flares that they've not been able to convert to productive use. Is there a way the EU can also take Africa into this form of interactions?
Okay.
Okay, great. Thank you so much. I think.
Okay, I am going to start with your question on energy supply. And it goes beyond actually Kazakhstan, right? It goes, where do we, now that we want to phase out energy from Russia, where do we get the energy? And if you look around, actually, all of the suppliers of energy have, repressive regimes, repressive authoritarian regimes. And so it's the same. Are we going to make the same mistake, right? That's sort of the feeling in the sort of the dilemma in the policy circles, that are we changing, you know, one autocrat for another, and, you know, getting rid of one dependency to yet create another dependency. Okay, so I think here in the short term, the choice is not great, actually. And what we hear actually is that, you know, many of the member states are getting back to fossil fuels, right? And to in charbon, and, you know, all of these dirty, you know, ways of producing energy, you know, challenging their own commitments on CO2 emissions. Okay, so in the longer run, I think the transition to clean energy is the answer, right? But we need to find a solution to in the short run. And yes, the choice is not great, but the idea, at least the way I understand it, is that you have to diversify so that you don't depend to such an extent on one particular regime, okay, on one particular authoritarian regime. Now, the question on Africa is right on spot. There have been numerous crises in Africa all along. I didn't mention those because we don't see them sufficiently in Europe. Even the crisis in the Middle East and North Africa, right, which is closer to home, we only saw it through the lens of, you know, immigrants coming, right? And you know, we didn't identify with these wars, with these struggles there. We do identify with what's happening in Ukraine, and that's why our reaction is different, right? You could argue this is blatantly racist, and you're probably right. The fact that, you know, the way in which we embraced the Ukrainian refugees, we didn't have the same attitude to the Middle East and North African refugees only a couple of years ago. On the contrary, our reaction was, you know, well, not everyone's, but there was quite a bit of securitization. We don't want them, they are a threat. Okay, so that's why I think, you know, this whole critical perspective is very, very important, right? Because, and Africa is right, you know, to a case a right case to illustrate that perspective, right? That we need to basically think differently about how we approach the continent. You know, that's not going to come easy, right? And maybe in academia, we're a little bit more open-minded, but these are assumptions that we have about how we've approached certain regions for years, right? And for policy making, it will be even more difficult, right? And maybe we have a responsibility here as an academic community, right? To, you know, make that voice, you know, make that argument a bit more persistently. Now, if I understand your point, it's, you know, can the EU be a bit more proactive, right? Because it has been a very reactive global actor so far. Well, part of the problem in the early days, in the Balkan War, in the days of the Balkan Wars, is that the EU didn't have the instruments, right, to do what we now know it can do. So you can't blame it back then for not acting, you know, more forcefully. But, you know, I think with the years, with the time, the EU has developed the tools, and now it's a matter of finding the political will to use those tools, okay? And that's why we need consensus. We don't get consensus for fast reactions. We always have the odd troublemaker that's going to block a decision. That's why, again, now we have a discussion about should we have qualified majority voting in CFSP, something which was a taboo many years ago, right? But you know, we are hearing this proposition made by very senior politicians, including the Commission President, saying, well, we can't proceed that way. Okay, we also, this is a question that goes to the core of the enlargement decisions, right? Enlargement policy, because the newcomers now are perceived as, you know, the troublemakers, right? And so the idea is, could they forego their veto, right? Or should we make that change happen before they come in, because otherwise there will be full paralysis, right? So these days, my answer is, it's not a matter of capacity instruments, it's a matter of political will. And that's what we need to master if we want the EU to be a geopolitical actor, right? I mean, if you want quick reaction in crisis situations, you have to be able to make those decisions. And with 27, and unanimity, it's not so obvious.
Okay, just gonna go downstairs because I feel weird like being here.
I know, that's why I'm here.
Yeah. So I don't know if there are other questions. We have around a few minutes more. So I will just ask you another one. Could you please elaborate on the consequences of the bid, the Ukrainian bid to become a candidate country and eventually a member state for the EU enlargement policy as a whole? So what consequences will this have perhaps for potential candidate countries such as Bosnia and Kosovo? Will they be, I mean, I don't know, it's very hard to predict, but do we have any signs to think that they will be included if Ukraine ends up being accepted as a candidate, as also candidates? How about existing candidates such as Montenegro, Albania, North Macedonia?
Well, I mean, the decision will sort of result in a total overhaul of the enlargement policy. Now, Ukraine will not become an EU member tomorrow, even if it is granted candidate status today. So there's a lot of, you know, reforms to do. And that is also the case for all the existing candidate countries. And in that sense, you know, they follow their own trajectory. So they are not in competition per se, right? Because all depends on how they manage to address the weaknesses of governance domestically. So I don't think that the Western Balkans should necessarily be threatened by, you know, newcomers, right, to the table. And actually, if you look back at the enlargement policy in the 90s and in the early 2000s, there was always a positive competition, right? So if I see my neighbor doing better, you know, this inspires me to do better, because ultimately you want to exceed. At least this is the official line. Now, if you compare at the moment where these countries stand in terms of democracy and in terms of law approximation, okay? So, you know, Ukraine and perhaps Moldova more or less on par, if even a little bit better on democratic standards with some of the front runners from the Western Balkans. When it comes to legal approximation, Ukraine has 63% of legislation of the EU already, you know, covered, complied with. And this is because of the way in which the ENP has worked in these countries, where, you know, the EU opened up the whole acquis communautaire for all of these countries to basically pick and choose and, you know, comply with on their own will. Whereas for the Western Balkans, the official accession process, you have to have a unanimous decision every time when a key chapter is opened or closed, which automatically slowed down the process. In terms of who is going to go further, right, the legislative part of the story is in Ukraine's favor, right, if you compare it with the frontrunners in the Western Balkans. But again, this is a process that they have to, you know, go through on their own. And clearly, Ukraine is at a disadvantage at the moment because it has an ongoing war on its territory, right? So no one can predict how these dynamics will play out in the future, but we are not talking about accession decisions tomorrow.
Thank you. Any other questions? Yes, so I have two hands, so I think it's easier to do it
Yeah.
this way. And then.
Thank you so much. My name is Olga Litvak. I'm the Graduate Forum Chair as well. And I'm interested actually, like we were talking a lot, of course, about Ukraine and the current discussion of the ex-Soviet countries accessing the EU. But there is one player which is just between Russia and Europe, and that is Belarus, which is currently in a very difficult situation, especially when it comes to civil society. And I guess you know that people coming from Belarus who were refugees, political refugees in Ukraine, are not falling under the current regulations for the refugees from the war in Ukraine. So people are kind of caught between two fires, and especially the dialect with the Belarus, as far as I understand, is currently kind of not existent, and it's still the Russian, kind of close to Russian government and Russian ally in the current situation. So that's what I hear, at least from the Belarusian diaspora. And what could you say about this kind of very isolated country? Because there was a lot of support for the civil society, lots of discussions in Europe after everything what happened where, but now with a new situation emerging and more critical situation, it kind of disappeared. And there is not much support from the EU in that direction. So what's your kind of take on how to deal with Belarus in the current situation?
Yes, let's take the other one.
Okay, I'm gonna have fun.
Oops.
This was gonna happen.
Hello, my name is Alina Nichik. I just finished my PhD at the University of Manchester, and I looked at the EU-Ukraine-Russia relations during the first year of the war in Ukraine, so 2014-15, and I see that a lot of things are still relevant for the current Russian invasion. And my question is going to be about the autonomy of EU foreign policy. And so what do you think, what is left of EU foreign policy if we take out US and NATO? And obviously there is something left, but in my interviews with EU, Ukrainian, Russian politicians, I found very diverse understanding of what is EU foreign policy. And it's Russian decision makers see no EU, they saw US as a decision maker, and they see NATO, and obviously they're afraid of NATO, they're threatened of NATO, that's why they started war, yes, as they say, but then why not dividing EU and NATO and telling clearly to the world this is EU and this is NATO? Yes, and then, for example, there are discussions about the EU army, and many people say we already have NATO, so we don't need the EU army then. But when that also came out from my interview, so when EU just discusses its army, Russia takes its words at face value and feels threatened. So why creating these misperceptions? And then in Ukraine, as well, people in the beginning of the war and now everyone was expecting for more help for EU because the EU said so, but the EU did not deliver that much. So there's now it's changing. It's very different compared to the first year. So thinking about these perceptions which EU foreign policy creates, and what is real EU foreign policy without perceptions, and what is left if there is no US and NATO. Thank you. Should I throw somewhere?
No, just
Keep it for time. All right, let me address the Belarus question. It's a tough one, and it has been a tough one even before the societal awakening in Belarus a couple of years ago. And the EU has basically tried everything vis-a-vis Belarus. It sanctioned Lukashenko and the cronies around him. It has, supported civil society and all of the dissidents and the progressive people. Now, it is really a pity that this revolution of a sort didn't succeed. right? Because if it had succeeded in Belarus, maybe we wouldn't be witnessing these events in the same scale, at least today in Ukraine. But I think one thing that the EU has done right in its reaction is to basically legitimize, well, Tikhanovskaya and her team, and you know, the alternative leadership of the country, and basically to you know, isolate Lukashenko. Now, this doesn't help civil society, unfortunately, and we know that people are being repressed. At the macro level, I don't think the EU can do much, right? Because you see, the EU can't democratize countries. This is a bottom-up process. This is something that has to come from within. The EU can tip the balance a little bit in favor of reformers, in favor of, you know, communities that would like democracy, but ultimately, it cannot democratize countries, right? It can give a hope, it can give an example and a model that people can aspire to, but ultimately this is a decision that concerns societies. And apart from keeping the current policy of sanctioning, well, Lukashenko, engaging and helping the leaders of the revolution outside the country, obviously abroad, and providing her, you know, the audience of a high political leader, right, top political leader, and helping civil society organizations, individuals, almost on an ad hoc basis. I'm not sure the EU can do much in this particular situation. And that's not an answer I'd like to give, but unfortunately, that's you know, how I see it. And then the other question, which is a bit provocative, does the EU have actorness, right? If I can reframe it in that way. We've had this debate actually in the early days, right? Is the EU an actor? There's a co-actorness debate, right? And I think most of us by now have kind of consented that yes, it is an actor, even though it's not a traditional actor. It's not it's maybe a sui generis actor of a sort. But again, not everything is about security, right? And about you know, military power. And if you look at the EU from other perspectives, it's a very powerful trade actor, right? It's also, if you look at it from a constructivist, it's a political community of values, right? And it has defined those values very, very clearly. So I wouldn't dismiss it automatically, although of course perceptions matter, right? How you are perceived by the others plays into your legitimacy as well to do things, right? Or to request things from the others. But, you know, if you open up, you know, paradigmatically about what an actor in international affairs is, probably, you know, I think we shouldn't dismiss the EU outright, even though obviously it's not a classical state with, you know, all the tools of sovereign states have, all the ways to, you know, military power and a standing army.
Thank you. We have still a few minutes. If you don't have questions, I will shoot again. Okay, I'm probably a terrible person that asks questions, because it's very hard to kind of predict what the future is going to be like in our disciplines, but my questions are mostly oriented there. So you've already spoken about the European neighborhood policy being completely, well, very much affected by what's going on at the moment. And we've seen, I mean, here we've talked mostly about the post-Soviet space, but also, of course, we've got the MENA region, which we've talked a little bit about the Middle East and North African region. So my question is, to what extent all these changes in Eastern Europe could affect the way the European Union is approaching its foreign relations with the MENA region. For example, as a Spaniard, I followed quite closely in the past 2 weeks. There was a big change in the Spanish position towards the Western Sahara, and it has affected very much how, especially its relations with Algeria, which is, by the way, major energy supplier now to the European Union. And of course, it has also changed its relations with Morocco. The European Union has backed this quite surprising decision, to be honest. If you follow Spanish domestic politics, it's been a former colony of Spain. How do you think, or these events that are currently happening will have an effect or not on the way the European Union approaches this region?
Oh, okay, so I mean, I think the current war in Ukraine does pose a fundamental challenge to the ENP, and many see that, you know, the ENP is dead. The way in which it is set up, structured now, you know, certainly the Eastern dimension after, you know, if Moldova, Ukraine and Georgia sort of are upgraded, right, to a candidate status, they are automatically out of the ENP, and the Eastern dimension of it becomes a little bit hollow, right? So there's Belarus there, which we haven't incorporated fully in the ENP for political reasons. What's left, Azerbaijan and Armenia. And so the game there changes, and also the multilateral track of the Eastern dimension, the Eastern partnership, perhaps it also loses a little bit its raison d'etre. So certainly when it comes to the Eastern dimension, right, you have to find a way of engaging Armenia and Azerbaijan is an energy supplier as well. So relations with it has always been a bit, you know, different. So there isn't much left, right? But the bigger question is indeed the MENA region, right? What can you do about the MENA region? Now, the MENA region was lumped together with Eastern Europe or the Eastern neighborhood quite artificially at the beginning, when the policy was set up in the early 2000s. So the argument has been, and actually the policy development has been, differentiation, East and South. So now you have actually a real opportunity to start, you know, anew in the MENA. Now, the problem in the MENA is that, you know, the EU is a very weak actor, right? It's one among very many others, and it's certainly not, you know, a game changer. Actually, we've seen the EU being isolated on many of the conflicts, right? In Libya, in Syria, so it's not even recognized as an important player. Whatever the EU decides, well, we also see that sort of the democracy agenda, right, has been toned down in the region itself, right? The EU has sort of toned down its expectations about democracy in the region, but the region itself has also regressed in some of the countries into more authoritarianism. Okay, so you know, now's the moment to basically reconsider what we do and how we do it, and whether, you know, we do it on a bilateral basis or whether we do it on a multilateral basis. This has always been, you know, the chicken and egg question. Should we do both? Should we prioritize one or the other? You know, ultimately now there's a chance to do it differently. And I am afraid the EU doesn't have much to offer to these countries, right? In the Eastern Partnership, you know, half of these countries in the Eastern Partnership see the EU as their future. This is not the case in the MENA. right? So they don't identify to the same extent to the European integration with the European integration project. So it's not so easy to sell to them, so to say, a deep and comprehensive free trade area, you know, as an incentive, as a big carrot, right? If they also don't see the European way of life as attractive, they may also not buy into the normative aspect of, you know, of the offer. Okay, so I think, you know, what becomes obvious as a trend globally, not only in that region, is towards more transactionalism, for better or for worse.
Thank you. I think we still have around 10 minutes. So if you have any questions, this is the actual moment. Otherwise, I will just keep going. Yeah, so another question, because in your lecture, I really liked how you divided foreign policy from this inside out. And I don't know if outside in was the other term to basically describe the two major perspectives that we can see your foreign policy. So from this inside out, I think it was, I was considering these two major movements or developments that have happened in the past few weeks. First, the decision by Denmark to come to the European defense policy, if I'm correct, and the other one, well, the recent change or shift in public opinion in Sweden and Finland to joining NATO and abandon their neutrality. So my question is, these two movements pointed to different institutions in the security realm. So one's the common defense policy of the European Union, and the other one is NATO. So to what extent are these movements maybe trumping further integration at the EU when it comes to security, or actually they will promote further integration? I'm saying, sorry, trumping, because of if the NATO becomes perhaps a stronger institution, will there be still a very, very big, deep integration at the EU?
Yes. Is there a trade-off here, right? Between, that's the autonomy debate. Now, the answer is, you need both, right? You need both a strong NATO and you need both a strong EU, you know, autonomous capability. There are situations there, and there will be more and more situations in the future in which NATO or the US may not want to intervene, and that the Europeans have to handle on their own. And we need capacity, right? We need capability. So this, you know, I know that the debate is often presented, you know, either one or the other, but actually the two go hand in hand. And the US has been very clear, you know, Europe has to be able to take care of its own backyard, so to say. So we need capability, our own capability for such situations. And no one wants to question sort of the US security guarantee in Europe. I think no one wants to challenge that. But at the same time, you know, even the US would prefer that we are more capable and more autonomous. Okay, so even as an ally in that alliance, we are, you know, better valued and stronger, right? And can push our view if actually we do stand, you know, more heavily in military terms, right? In terms of capability. So I don't see them as contradictory, okay? Although they, you know, they both happen because, you know, there is a threat out there that everyone sees now. And so they don't surprise me in that sense that they are happening simultaneously. If Putin has done something, this is to unite us, right? Even more, okay? And unfortunately, these, you know, developments happen through these tragic, you know, events. But you know, the consequences that everyone at the moment is trying to regroup and you know, seeking alliances that you know, will protect us potentially from that threat.
Thank you. We have a few. Yes, Olga, please.
Yeah, I wanted to throw in also a comment question now on what you said as well, that like the very small unity nowadays, and that's what we see. But at the same time, you mentioned in your speech, and we also know it, but it's been going for quite some time with the Orban government and like Polish government as well. There are some countries that are quite often not really living up to these democratic standards that they promised before when they were joining the EU. And basically there are limited capabilities of dealing with them, and these problems nowadays also accentuated the actually lack of unity or divisions in the opinions between these countries and Brussels, for example. So what's your take on that, how the situation will develop? Because especially with the case of Hungary, there was a lot of discussions of how to sanction the country for for problems with democratic freedoms or the LGBTIQ situation. Also with Poland, we also have the abortion rights. So there are some problems existing in the EU. And nowadays we also see that these are exactly quite often the countries that kind of contradict the general line and that are not living up to this democratic standards. So what's your take on the future of this development? What should we expect in this kind of internal policy influenced by the foreign relations of these countries as well?
Before you answer, we have just 5 minutes before the end of the session. So if someone has a question that needs to be very quickly answered, this is your moment. Otherwise, we will close with this answer.
Okay, on Poland and Hungary, I mean, I'm more hopeful on the Polish case and less so on the Hungarian case. But what can the EU do here, right? We have a government that's elected democratically and that uses this mandate to actively dismantle checks and balances and to, consolidate a crony regime that is becoming abusive of, freedoms, rights of sexual individuals and sexual minorities in particular. Now, the EU does have the instruments to sanction such behavior. So again, this is a matter of political will. Because in the moment when we are discussing huge amounts of money from, the common pot post-pandemic, right, there is sort of the stick that the EU can use to basically request, sort of get some, improvements on the domestic fronts. We've seen that the EU is very reluctant to do so. Very, very reluctant. And from what I read on the Polish case, it's even, going backward on the sort of stronger position it had amassed. Perhaps this has something to do with sort of the crisis moment that we are in. And had this been a normal time when there is no war, I think probably the Commission would have been a bit more forceful here. But ultimately, there is no easy solution, because even if you use this sanctioning mechanism, you may aggravate the situation basically, and you may make things worse, because ultimately Orban has to be voted out by Hungarians, right? We can't just remove him. And if the Hungarians don't want to see him in the light in which he acts, there is not much we can do, right? We can work with the opposition, we can work with civil society, but unfortunately, a lot of sort of the liberal thinking Hungarians have left anyway. So that's why, it's very important to try and understand why these people vote in the way they vote and how we can sort of change their calculus. Okay. But again, it's not an easy situation for the EU to react, but the instruments are there and they have always been there, right? It's a matter of how we actually gather the political will to use them. And there's no consensus here. Okay. There's no consensus here. Well, that's on the internal question. Now, Orban, but not only Orban, you know, other countries, I mentioned Bulgaria, they are troublemakers in foreign policy making, right? And so here, you know, the answer is, you know, go to qualified majority voting, but you need a unanimous vote to basically agree on qualified majority of voting. And so it's again one of those situations in which, you know, I'm not so hopeful that it will happen very soon, although, you know, these days, you know, a lot of taboos have fallen. So why don't we, you know, hope for the better and maybe, you know, expect that, you know, that's one that's the next to fall, because it really, you know, constrains Europe from being that proactive global power that we all want to see Europe.
Okay, so, well, indeed, quite a few things have changed when it comes to EU foreign policy in the past few weeks. So it's been actually excellent to have an expert who could put us a bit up to date when it comes to EU foreign policy. First of all, thank you so much. This was actually fantastic.